It's hard to know where to begin when it comes to recommending or even talking about Outer Wilds. Almost anything I could say about it could be construed as a spoiler, and if there's one game I'd give anything to play again for the first time, this would be it. So if you're here and you haven't played the game, I want to say to you in big capital letters, stop watching, drop everything, play this game. Trust me. The title of this video should tell you everything you need to know. In case my fanatical enthusiasm for the game isn't enough to convince you, I'll keep this intro as spoiler free as I can so that you can hear a little more about the game, but if you're already sold on it, then I would highly recommend pausing here and finding out what makes the game so good on your own. To sum up Outer Wilds in one word, I'd say that it's all about discovery. The 10-second pitch is that you explore a solar system with your spaceship, disembarking when you see something that you think deserves a closer look. Over time, as you explore more of the different planets in the system, you'll come to piece together the history of the system and why certain things are the way they are. The game doesn't give you a definite goal or objective, you're left to just explore and discover, led by your own curiosity. Just like in most games, as you progress you'll be able to access places that you couldn't before. Unlike most other games, however, progression in Outer Wilds doesn't happen because you got a new ability or tool or upgrade or anything like that. In fact, discounting the very short and mostly skippable tutorial at the beginning, there's nothing like upgrades or new abilities to be found anywhere in the game. In Outer Wilds, progression happens whenever you gain a new understanding about the world you're in, and that new understanding will allow you to reach new places or discover things that were hidden to you before. The game world doesn't change, only your understanding of it does, and your mind will be blown again and again as realization after realization start to pile up. When you eventually do reach the end game, it's not because you were given a goal and told what to do to reach the ending, it's because you learned enough about the state of the world to realize for yourself what needs to be done to bring things to an end. This is why almost anything I could show or describe about the game could be counted as a spoiler. Any example I might use to show you how good this game is would take from you the opportunity to discover it for yourself, and pretty much ruin that part of the experience for you. More than any other game I can think of, Outer Wilds really does demand to be played as blind as possible. This alone would be refreshing and unique enough to justify a strong recommendation, but I've barely scratched the surface of what makes this game so great. Outer Wilds solves so many problems that bigger budget games have been struggling with for years, and it makes the whole thing look effortless. If you're tired of mind-numbing open-world games that are boring to traverse and have the same content copied and pasted dozens of times, play Outer Wilds. If you're frustrated with having every modern game hold your hand with waypoints, mini-maps and overly generous checkpoints, play Outer Wilds. If you've been waiting for a game that makes you feel like originality isn't dead, and that revolutionary new ideas are still possible, for the love of God, do yourself a favour and play Outer Wilds. I have only one caveat that I think you should know, because not every game can be for everyone. Outer Wilds is a game that asks slightly more of the player than the average casual blockbuster. The game trusts you to be curious and invested enough to want to explore and see the thing around the next corner, or on the next planet, as the case may be. You need to meet the game halfway to make this work, and that's the way Outer Wilds is best experienced in my opinion, by setting aside a weekend and letting yourself get fully immersed in it. If that doesn't sound like the kind of thing you're into, then sadly I think Outer Wilds is probably not for you. But if you've listened to this intro and been excited or intrigued by anything I've said, then this is your last chance to stop the video and come back after you've finished the game. And know that I envy you the experience of playing one of the best and most important games in years for the first time. If you're still here, then I hope that means you've played the game for yourself. But even so, I think it's worth giving a summary of what a playthrough of Outer Wilds looks like. Your first few minutes on Timber Hearth offer a natural space for a brief tutorial that introduces you to almost everything you'll come up against when you actually start exploring space. You learn to use your signal scope, you learn about deadly ghost matter and how to detect it, you learn how to navigate in 0G. This is mostly standard tutorial stuff. When you get into the museum exhibits in the observatory, however, the game is teaching you something a little bit more subtle. It's teaching you to pay attention. You get the chance to use a gravity crystal, experience the strange effects of a quantum shard, and translate your first Nomai text. But the most important thing you learn here is that Outer Wilds is a game that wants you to be curious. The gist of the story is that you're the newest member of your planet's space program, about to take their maiden voyage, and for the first time, you'll be equipped with a translator capable of reading the text of the Nomai, an alien race that was here in the distant past. It's unknown why or how they came here, or what happened to them, but their remnants have been found all over the solar system. If you're anything like me, then this is already a pretty strong hook for an exploration game, but the plot thickens one more time as you're leaving the observatory, when the Nomai statue suddenly activates and does something to you. We don't know what yet. Now that you're free to take off in your ship, it's completely up to you where you go first. Maybe you'll go to Brittle Hollow, a fragile planet orbited by a volcanic moon, and discover Nomai ruins that lead down to one of their underground complexes. Maybe you'll spot the Nomai escape pod still lingering on the surface and stop to investigate. If you make it down the crumbling path without falling, maybe you'll find the temporary settlement built by the Nomai below it, with some clues about where the escape pod came from, and how there may be others. Or maybe you won't go to Brittle Hollow at all, and you'll instead go straight to the enormous Giant's Deep, being orbited by the ruins of some massive orbital cannon. If you land on it and investigate, you may discover that the cannon was damaged during firing, and that one of its modules is missing, though you might not know yet why you should care. Maybe you'll visit Giant's Deep itself, then get scared and fly away again. Or maybe instead you'll head straight for the Hourglass Twins, two strange planets that orbit together close to the sun. Perhaps you'll spot another one of those Nomai escape pods, or maybe it will be your first one. If you follow through the caves beneath it, you may find the Sunless City, a huge Nomai settlement with multiple zones and a huge amount of writing to discover and translate. Or maybe instead you'll lift off from your home planet and touch down on the other side of it to explore a Nomai mining site. Or maybe you do one of these things instead. I think you get the idea by now. There's an incredible number of possibilities for where you could go or what you could do on your first time picking up Outer Wilds, but there's one thing they all have in common. Assuming you don't die from falling, crashing or suffocating, then after 22 minutes of exploring, this will happen. Your consciousness will be sent back to the beginning of a time loop, with all your memories intact, ready to blast off again with the knowledge and experience you gained last time, with your ship's log keeping track of what you've discovered, where you discovered it, and where new information is still to be discovered. I want to take a minute here to say just how good it feels to explore the solar system of Outer Wilds. The physics of each planet orbiting the sun is actually simulated in real time by the game's engine, and as you careen around in your tiny ship, you really do feel like you're at the mercy of forces that are much greater than you. This kind of spectacle is one of the things that Outer Wilds absolutely excels at. It's difficult to put into words the kind of terror that this game is capable of producing in a player. My first time plunging into the atmosphere of Giant's Deep was a truly frightening experience that I got used to over time until I had to go under the surface of the water and felt that creeping terror all over again. It was a long time into my first playthrough before I gathered the courage to venture deep into the chasm on the Ember Twin. Something about the darkness and the unknown of it just made me intensely afraid to go down there. If you've played the game yourself, then the anglerfish of Dark Bramble will need no explanation here. But behind all of these moments is a primal, cosmic terror of the emptiness and indifference of space that underpins the whole game, and makes itself known every time you find yourself floating in the void, unsure of whether you can make it back to your ship. This is a game where volcanic moons will eject magma into your path, where gravity creates a crushing weight of sand that can bury you alive. Cyclones can launch islands clean into space with you on top of them, and an entire planet crumbles and breaks apart in real time right in front of your eyes. Basically, it's fucking scary. But anyway, you learn to overcome that fear, and you keep exploring to search for answers. Oftentimes, exploring an area will only leave you with more questions than when you entered. Other times, you'll discover some information in one place that will help you understand something elsewhere, which will then allow you to discover more things, and so on and so on. Eventually, over many loops, you're able to piece together the tale of the Nomai. From light years away, they detected a signal from something in this solar system called the Eye of the Universe, an object which paradoxically seemed to be older than the universe itself, and travelled here in their mothership called the Vessel to investigate. The vessel got trapped inside the Dark Bramble, and 3 escape pods were ejected. One made it to Brittle Hollow, one to Ember Twin, and the 3rd unfortunate pod remained stuck inside Dark Bramble, with no way out for its unlucky inhabitants. Settlements were constructed on the planets where the escape pods landed, each with its own shrine to the mysteries of the Eye which brought the Nomai to the system. The 2 surviving groups were able to establish contact with each other, but when they returned to their original mission of seeking the Eye of the Universe, they found that the signal had stopped. Still determined to find it, they built a locator on the moon of Timber Hearth, but it didn't work. They built another, more advanced locator in the southern observatory of Brittle Hollow, but it also didn't work, and the Nomai came up with a more far-fetched scheme to find what they were looking for. From their experimentation with black holes, they discovered that when you travel through one, you come out the corresponding white hole on the other side slightly before you entered, and using this time-shifting technology, the Nomai developed a plan. They would send out a probe in a random direction, see if it encountered the Eye of the Universe, and then send that information and the consciousnesses of the scientists involved back in time to before the probe's launch, repeating this in a time loop an uncountable number of times until, by random chance, the probe happened to go in the right direction to encounter the Eye. The only way to generate enough power to send information back by the required span of 22 minutes was to make the sun go supernova and harness the energy output from that. Everything needed for this plan was successfully constructed. The probe cannon in orbit around Giant's Deep, the sun station meant to force the sun into supernova, and the Ash Twin project, responsible for sending the data back by 22 minutes and keeping the cycle going, built in the center of one of the planets nearest the sun, inside an impenetrable shell of rock mined from Timber Hearth. On top of all this, there are numerous testing sites to be found, and a black hole forge where the essential teleportation and time-bending technology was created and refined. With everything ready to go, the Nomai activated the sun station to kickstart the cycle, but found to their immense disappointment that it wasn't capable of setting off a supernova reaction. As they licked their wounds and began to think up alternatives, a strange comet was detected entering the solar system, and the Nomai sent one of their shuttles to investigate. Tragically, this was the comet that brought ghost matter to the solar system, and when its core burst, it sent a deadly wave through the system and wiped out the remaining Nomai. The progenitors of the Hearthians were spared from this deadly wave because they lived in water, which insulated them from the ghost matter. Of course, all of this happens many thousands of years before your player character is even born, and it's up to you to put it all together piece by piece as you explore and figure it out. Around the time the game begins, the sun is close to going supernova as it reaches the natural end of its life, which has caused the Nomai's plan to activate, prompting the statue in the observatory to bond with you and leaving you trapped in a 22-minute time loop. Through talking to a fellow explorer NPC, you can learn that all the other stars in the sky are going supernova too, and that the universe is nearing its natural end. Piecing together the remnants of the Nomai's convoluted plan, you're eventually able to uncover the coordinates of the Eye of the Universe, and the remains of their mothership, the Vessel, albeit without a working power supply. Once you get inside the Ash Twin project and get access to its own still functioning power supply, things should suddenly click into place as you realize what needs to be done. And with that realization, that connection made in your mind, without the game having to tell you what to do next, you've reached the endgame. By this point, you should understand the implications of removing the warp core from the Ash Twin project, and you'll probably begin a new time loop just to be on the safe side before doing so, because you know that taking out this power source will break the loop. For that reason, this is one of the most terrifying moments in the game, as you know that you can't trust in the loop to bring you back if you die. So, perched on the last atom of the edge of your seat, you grab the warp core from the Ash Twin project and make your way back to the vessel trapped inside Dark Bramble. Insert the warp core and the coordinates for the Eye of the Universe, and you teleport down to the Eye, experience some frightening and trippy quantum phenomena, get taken back to a representation of the Herthian Observatory, and have one last campfire with your friends before the Eye fulfills its purpose and gives birth to a new universe to take the place of the dying one. I'm mostly glossing over this last 20 minutes of the game because it's linear and it's more about tying off the journey with an impressive spectacle than anything else. But don't get me wrong, it is impressive, and it pulls off a fitting end to a game that could otherwise have left you feeling pretty nihilistic. And there you have it, roll credits. Hearing the story of Outer Wilds all in one go like this doesn't really do it justice. It's a story told through translated text, through the placement of objects, and through environmental cues, with plenty of additional things to discover that aren't essential to make it to the end. I completely left out all of the intrigue surrounding the Quantum Moon, which is something you can spend hours discovering when you're playing the game for yourself. There's a lot more to Outer Wilds than just the story of the Nomai though. Your own personal story as a traveller and explorer is equally as important, and it's one that you write yourself as you play. The number of possibilities for which order you discover things is, appropriately, astronomically high, and I feel confident saying that no two players' experiences with the game will ever be exactly alike. While it's enjoyable to speculate on the story of the Nomai, the real joy of talking about Outer Wilds with other players is in sharing the personal experiences you had with the game. The first time you fell into Brittle Hollow's black hole and realised it didn't kill you. That time you forgot to put on your spacesuit and suffocated on a planet's surface. The first time you were eaten by an anglerfish, and how long it took before you felt brave enough to go back to Dark Bramble. The way you felt when that final music kicked in after you removed the warp core from the Ash Twin project. The truly special thing about Outer Wilds isn't the story written by the developers, it's the journey you take yourself on while you're discovering it for the first time. Replaying the game like I did for this video can never be the same as that first playthrough, because you'll remember bits of information from your previous playthroughs which will give you shortcuts through that web of discovery you're supposed to go through. Thanks to this, Outer Wilds is a game that you can only properly play once, which explains the long list of positive Steam reviews from players wishing they could erase their memory and play it again for the first time, myself included. So with that summary out of the way, I want to spend the rest of this video going over some of the finer points of the design of Outer Wilds, and explain just what I think makes it one of the most important, unique and special games we've seen for a long time, starting with an issue that anyone who's played a AAA game in the last few years will be familiar with. Most open world games have a problem. A few problems, actually. They're repetitive, padded out with filler content, and usually way too long, but their greatest sin is in being big, empty, boring spaces. That map may look like it's covered in icons for hundreds of things to do, but I think that players have long since wised up to the fact that it's really just 4 things multiplied a few dozen times each. Valid complaints about filler content aside though, there's a much more insidious issue that's crept into open world games thanks to these kinds of maps, namely that they teach players not to pay attention to the actual game world itself. After all, why bother trying to find your way around a complicated 3D space when you can just look at an omniscient 2D representation of it instead? And best of all, thanks to those map markers, you can just go straight from one icon to the other without ever needing to explore for yourself or having to think about the world you're in as an actual space. These games may give you a gigantic world to explore, but by covering it with map markers and icons, they're telling you exactly what's worth seeing and doing, with the usually correct implication being that there's nothing in between those markers worth seeing or doing. This is why I feel justified in calling most open worlds big, empty and boring, despite the ludicrous amount of icons that might trick you into thinking otherwise. Mercifully, most modern open world games have a fast travel feature that will instantly transport you to certain landmarks so that you only need to move in a straight line for a minute or two to get to your destination. But the fact remains that getting between these icons usually consists of nothing more interesting than holding forward on your controller. All of this obscures the fact that during these in-between moments, you're essentially doing nothing but waiting to get to the content. You might as well be selecting activities from a menu. It's like a time tax you have to pay when you're playing a game set in an open world. I think there are a couple of reasons why this icon-heavy approach has been adopted by so many studios. Firstly, because they know that reviewers are only going to play their game for a few hours anyway, so they can have an impressive looking map with lots of content and be safe in the knowledge that reviewers are unlikely to be as frustrated by the copy and paste nature of it all as actual players will be. Secondly, and this one is more key from a design perspective, they can make absolutely sure that players have something to aim for and actually find the content that they spent several years making. I can see the logic in this, but by letting players ignore the world and allowing them to rely on a simple 2D map, it does a massive disservice to the environmental designers who worked to make the assets and the world that the game is set in, so somebody on the design team is still losing out. I think that this tendency for hand-holding stems from a lack of faith in the player to explore and find the content for themselves, which ultimately comes from a lack of faith in the game to hold their attention long enough to let them do so. Subnautica is a game that gets around this problem by simply not having a map at all, which was a brilliant design choice that I covered in more detail in my video on its sequel. That game leans heavily on its ability to make the player feel alone and afraid of the unknown. Having a map would give the player a relief from that feeling and completely ruin the game's atmosphere. Breath of the Wild strikes a kind of middle ground here, as it gives the player a map and fast travel, but still asks them to use their own senses to identify and mark points of interest in the world. I would have given Death Stranding a shout out here for having an open world that it doesn't fill with tons of pointless time-wasting bullshit, instead asking the player to focus intently on the way they traverse the world. I would have said that if the director's cut hadn't been announced to feature tons of pointless time-wasting bullshit all over the map. Outer Wilds has its own ingenious solutions to these open-world problems. First off, it has a trust in the player's curiosity that most big-budget games are simply not willing to risk. When the player first flies into space, they immediately have the freedom to go wherever they please. But this freedom is not overwhelming because there are really only a handful of planets to choose from. You don't get a minimap or objective marker telling you where you have to go first. You just take a look around, point your ship towards something that piques your interest, and start exploring. The game does feature a map of the solar system that can be opened at any time, but the only information this gives the player is the current positions of the planets. Information that doesn't actually help much with navigation and can just as easily be gleaned by looking around in space. When you actually arrive at a planet, however, there are no maps to be seen. So how were the developers able to make sure that the player found the content worth seeing on each planet without wandering around for hours? Outer Wilds has a truly elegant answer for this. Simply put, they made sure that every location either has something important or nothing at all. You can immediately tell from a glance whether it's worth landing your ship somewhere because there will be something clearly visible there. This means that it's also possible to hold most of the important landmarks on a planet in your head at once, further reducing the need for any hand-holdy waypoints or patronizing minimaps. This principle of design extends to the locations you explore on foot as well. In Outer Wilds, your ship's log updates with any new information you find while you're out exploring, and that information is sorted by planet and location, hopefully warning you if there's still something you haven't found in a certain area. Generally speaking, a thorough look around an area should reveal everything of importance, and the ship's log will never leave you in any doubt as to whether you've missed something. The game doesn't hold your hand, but it doesn't make you waste your time pixel hunting either. The point of Outer Worlds is not really to make you search for information, it's to let you find information and then enjoy piecing it together in your head. This is why it's so key that Outer Wilds makes it immediately clear where there is and isn't content, and whether or not you've already seen everything in an area or not. Because the game doesn't want you to spend hours searching for something to do, It wants you to get straight to the discovery. The truly brilliant thing is that it pulls this off without resorting to minimaps or icons plastered everywhere. It lets you do it all with your own two eyes, and allows you to feel much more connected to the world you're in. Without that map telling you beforehand which locations are and are not important, every location in the game takes on a potentially equal level of importance. It may seem like a subtle difference, but this focus makes Outer Wilds feel worlds apart from other games. There's another common open world problem that Outer Wilds solves, as a convenient side effect of it being set across an entire solar system. Your average open world game needs to find a way to keep the player within the bounds of the world, which usually involves putting some barrier around the edges of the map, or setting the game on an island surrounded by a featureless body of water. In Outer Wilds this isn't a concern, as every planet can be explored fully and naturally loops back around on itself. This is an intrinsic advantage of a 3D geometry over a 2D one, and it also means that traversal is far more interesting, which neatly solves another common open world problem. You can have the most inventive setting in the world, but if it's boring to move around, then a lot of players won't make it to the end of your game. In most open world games, this is where fast travel comes in, sidestepping the problem of making traversal interesting by just not making you traverse. Outer Wilds has no need for fast travel since every planet is reachable within a minute or so of taking off in your ship, although it does have something akin to time travel, in the form of resting at campfires to quickly pass time if you're waiting for an event later in the time loop. With the addition of the jetpack though, Outer Wilds pulls a Super Mario 64 and makes the act of moving around so enjoyable that traversal is rarely the tedious time waste it can feel like in other open world games. Using the jetpack is an inherently satisfying way of moving around the planets, and combined with the 3D nature of those planets, it means that travelling on foot is almost never as simple as just holding forward on the controller. With each world having its own value of gravity, there's enough variety to make traversal something that needs to be considered carefully and can't be taken for granted. The jump across this gap on Giant's Deep illustrates that point well, as this fairly simple jump feels a lot more risky under the planet's high gravity. The flight across the ruined Sun Station Bridge might be the high point of tense movement challenges in the game, and even on subsequent playthroughs it had my heart leaping into my throat. On planets with lower gravity you can pull off ridiculous leaps that will send you into orbit if you're not careful, and it just feels damn good to nail a jump and land right where you wanted to. I think the lack of maps and icons contributes to the success of Outer Wilds' movement mechanics as well, because without a map to rely on, the player needs to pay more attention to their surroundings by necessity. Following the instructions in the cave on Embertwin to reach the Sunless City is infinitely more satisfying when you're doing it with your own senses, rather than just following a map marker. It forces you to take in the world around you and use your own spatial reasoning and navigational skills, skills that it seems almost every other open world game has given up on rewarding. When following the route towards the Southern Observatory on Brittle Hollow, you'll spot that some gravity crystals are missing from the trail. By following the path of their empty holders, you can spot where the trail resumes and make your own daring leap across the chasm to the next crystal. This is a small and fairly simple moment, but it's one that asks you to use your own powers of spatial reasoning to solve an unexpected problem, and it's a moment that I don't think could have existed in a more standard, hand-holding open world game. For another example, look at the giant cyclone on Giant's Deep, which hides a quantum secret in its center and requires you to take a leap of logic to figure out for yourself how to get inside, and also to guess that there even is anything in there to begin with. One more thing before I move on, because I should address a contradiction you might have spotted in my argument. Earlier I complained about open world games that just make you hold forward on your controller to get to the content, and I have to admit that this is the case in Outer Wilds as well when it comes to travelling between planets. And yes, I realise the irony of complaining about the empty open worlds of other games when the vast majority of Outer Wilds' play area is literally empty space, but hear me out. A common complaint against Outer Wilds is that the time loop forces the player to constantly watch the clock, never giving them time to explore at their own leisure. This also has the side effect of making players repeat content in order to reach the spot where they died or ran out of time on their previous run. There are some well-hidden shortcuts to find that can cut down on the need to redo areas over and over, which also gives you more loop time for exploration and makes it more likely you can get everything done in one loop. But again, I have to concede that this is a valid criticism that may turn some frustrated players away. In my own experience with Outer Wilds, however, I was willing to completely forgive the slight inconvenience brought by the game's strict adherence to the rules of the time loop, because the consistency it brings serves a higher purpose that is, in my opinion, a more than worthy trade-off. And that purpose is immersion. Immersion is a part of games that I think is unique to games. That capability they have to put you in a believable world and make you think and feel as if you were really there yourself. Once you've played a few different games, however, it's easy enough to see that some are more immersive than others, even among similar genres. In any given game, there are going to be factors that make and factors that break immersion. World design, believability, and consistency are examples of things that contribute to an immersive experience, whereas elements that get in the way of that believability are things that break immersion. I want to argue here that the problem plaguing a lot of modern games is not a lack of the former, but too much of the latter. And of course, like the good little fanboy I am, I'll also argue why I think Outer Wilds finds a solution to this problem. When I say things that break immersion, what I really mean are things that remind you that you're playing a game, that the world you're in isn't real, and that there are no real consequences to what you do in it. Thanks to the ease with which it can be broken, immersion can be a very fragile thing, and once the illusion is shattered, it can be impossible to repair. When I first played Alien Isolation, I was having a reasonably fun time with it, right up until the first time the alien killed me and sent me back to a checkpoint, after which I no longer found it scary, and stopped playing not long after. The believability of the game and the illusion that I was in danger was completely gone for me. Dying and reloading is the ultimate immersion killer, as it lets you know that there are actually no stakes, and that you and your character won't actually suffer any real consequences. In most games, this creates a profound disconnect between player and character, as they're supposedly fearing for their life in a perilous situation, while you're sitting comfortably in the knowledge that you can respawn and try again as many times as you like. In a sense, then, almost every game features a time loop when you die and respawn at a checkpoint, sent back in time but retaining whatever knowledge you gained from your previous attempt. Time is essentially wound backwards to a fixed point, erasing whatever mistake led to your death. The difference in Outer Wilds is that your character is going through that loop as well as you, making every death canonical to your own story. With this subtle difference, the disconnect between player and character isn't there, and the immersion isn't broken when you die. Almost paradoxically, the game's acknowledgement that the game's time loop ultimately makes everything meaningless is the thing that makes the game feel real. With your character knowing that they're stuck in a loop, absolutely anything you might try doing can be justified as a rational action. Flying into the sun in frustration because you can't solve a puzzle? That's a believable response from someone who's been through a dozen time loops and knows they'll appear back at the start either way. Even the way the player chooses to approach the game's puzzles and mysteries abides by these rules of immersion. Brute forcing a puzzle or problem because you can't figure out or don't realize that there is a better solution still makes total sense from your character's point of view. Something like trying endlessly to land your ship on a quickly orbiting solar station can be rationalized when you consider it from the mindset of someone who knows they'll be dead in the next 20 minutes either way. When you've finished exploring somewhere but don't have enough time left in the loop to go somewhere new, you'll probably be tempted to die on purpose so that you can get back to the next loop more quickly. Once again, this really is a believable trick that someone stuck in a loop like this would use, so it doesn't get in the way of immersion like it would in, say, a horror game. Though the fact that immersion isn't broken doesn't make it any less annoying to be left stranded in space just waiting to run out of oxygen. There's a meditate option in the pause menu that can be discovered by talking to the only other NPC who finds themselves stuck in a loop, but I never quite liked having to go into the menu to use it. A more interesting option here might have been a button to let you manually remove your helmet in space, but maybe it would have been a bit too gruesome. I think the immersion-breaking nature of using menus is probably the reason for my dislike of the meditate option in Outer Wilds. I've complained enough already about maps and markers in open world games, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much here, but I do want to point out just how much Outer Wilds gains in immersive potential by not having them. This is kind of a 2-for-1 deal that comes with solving the open world problem I mentioned in the previous chapter. By asking the player to rely on their own senses, you're naturally making them more immersed in the game by forcing them to consider the world as a real place. This principle can be seen in plenty of other open world games too. The undisputed highlights of games like Metal Gear Solid 5 and Far Cry are those parts where you have an open-ended goal and are given the freedom and responsibility to find your own solution using the limited information available to your own senses. When a game makes you constantly open maps and menus, you're regularly being taken out of it and reminded that it's not real by interacting with these abstractions. In Breath of the Wild, the food system is accessed via the pause menu, so the world pretty much freezes when you pause in the middle of combat and you have an unlimited amount of time to heal yourself. Not particularly immersive, I think you'll agree, and the same applies to map screens, which offer the player an omniscient top-down view of a game's world, with an infinite amount of time to pore over it, negating any need for them to pay attention to the game world. Outer Wilds' restraint in the placement of its content is key to the game's immersive feel as well, because it's what allows the player to be able to rely on their own senses in the first place. For an example of the polar opposite, look at the new Hitman series, which has levels that are so sprawling, with so much clutter that seeing a level for the first time usually feels completely overwhelming. Every interactable item needs to be clearly highlighted, otherwise figuring out what to do would be hopeless. In games that give the player this kind of helping hand, you're subconsciously pushed towards relying on it and only seeing the things highlighted by it. You might find yourself entering a room, grabbing everything shiny and then leaving without really taking in your surroundings, because you didn't need to take in your surroundings. The world may be visually believable, but these little conveniences serve to boil the game down to its most basic interactive parts, making the game's world feel less like a real place and more like a level that's been designed. This is what I mean when I say that most modern games are let down by immersion-breaking features, despite their graphical fidelity. By removing clutter and allowing the player to use their own senses rather than some object-highlighting supersense, Outer Wilds also removes the need for the crutches of convenience that plague so many other games. You know what's important and what isn't, not because the game tells you, but because you can plainly see it for yourself, which is far more immersive. I should say here that immersive does not necessarily mean realistic. The planets in Outer Wilds are clearly too small to actually exist in reality, and refilling your oxygen tank by standing near a tree is obviously a contrivance for the sake of gameplay. This doesn't harm immersion, however, because it's consistent with the rules that are set up in this world. Consistency more than realism is what's important for a game to feel immersive. And this is why I'm willing to forgive that Outer Wilds forces players to repeat content if they run out of time or die while exploring an area. In order for the time loop mechanics to work at all, the game needs to start you in the same place every time. A respawn mechanic that brought you back to a spot near where you died would completely destroy any stakes that you feel when exploring, and would kill the immersive feel of the game. The ship's log retaining information between loops is the one bit of inconsistency I can think of when it comes to the rules of the time loop, though you could explain it away by saying that it's actually your character inputting the info they remember into the computer each time, so I'll let it slide. Outer Wilds is, without question, the most immersive experience I've ever had in a game, and it's the kind of game I've been waiting for a very long time. Of all the games I've played, and I've played a lot, this is the one that comes closest to a perfect union of gameplay and storytelling. Story revelations in Outer Wilds don't occur in cutscenes at predetermined intervals. They don't even occur in a predetermined order. They happen in your head as you piece things together and come to understand the sad fate of the Nomai without the need for cutscenes and without control ever being taken away from the player. The more I think about it, the more I think that's what immersion really means. The feeling that you're living and writing this story of your own as you play. That everything that happens is real and not just a playground or challenge to beat before moving on to the next one. In that respect, Outer Wilds is miles ahead of anything else I've played in the last few years. Before I move on, let me share a story from my first playthrough of Outer Wilds that I think demonstrates the power of its immersive potential. I had just found the Know My Escape pod on Brittle Hollow and opened the emergency hatch at the back, revealing to me for the first time the yawning black hole at the planet's centre. I jumped down to the rickety platform below, and when it surprised me by collapsing under my weight, I didn't react quickly enough to jump to another platform. As gravity started its evil work and pulled me down to the planet's core, where I had no idea what would happen to me when I made contact, the pure terror I felt at that moment was incomparable to anything I felt in any other game. Instinctively, I fired off my jetpack in a vain attempt to find some other safe spot to land, and it sent me looping around the black hole. I was so into it that I was trying to push the stick on my controller further than it's supposed to go, as if my brain really felt like it was under the same G-force as my character. I spotted the gravity well, which seemed to be my only hope, and tried to boost myself into it, which I managed to do on my second pass, and as I came out safely at the top, I honest to God put down my controller and stared at the screen in awed relief for a minute, amazed that this game had been able to get such a heart-stopping reaction out of me. This is another one of those experiences that can never happen quite the same on a second playthrough when you're coming to the game with some pre-existing knowledge. Knowing exactly what the black hole does would have taken the edge off it a bit, to say the least. It goes to show just how important that first playthrough is, because in Outer Wilds, knowledge is everything. Think about how many times this has happened to you in a game. You get to some new area and you see a ledge that's too high for you to reach. If you've played a lot of games, then your instincts will immediately tell you that you need to come back later once you find the double jump ability. While this is a tried and tested way of gating off certain areas of a game until the player has done whatever is required to get that ability, I think it's fair to say it's getting a little stale after decades of use. It doesn't necessarily need to be a double jump. It could be the ability to crawl, or to move quickly, or to grapple onto objects. Either way, it's often painfully obvious to an experienced player what ability they'll need to get before coming back later. Gates like this force the player to go through the game in a certain order, and developers can use them to control a player's progression and make sure that the more difficult parts of a game are the ones a player will see last. Almost every game has some kind of progression system. Without one, there'd be nothing to stop you seeing the ending 5 minutes after booting the game. In the vast majority of games, progression is handled by gates. You might need to beat a boss in order to get to the next area, for example. Progression might be linear, as in a game like Bayonetta, where levels follow each other in a predefined order, meaning you have no choice but to hunker down and beat a level to see the next one. In other games, progression is more open, like Dark Souls or Hollow Knight, where you can go and explore elsewhere if one area is giving you trouble. In these more open games, sometimes it's even possible to completely skip certain bosses or areas by making use of alternative routes and progressing a different way. This can complicate things quite a bit, and I think it's no coincidence that games with this kind of open-ended progression often end up being favoured by speedrunners, a community constantly on the lookout for ways to trick or bypass a game's intended progression gates. But even in these more open examples, there's still something distinctly digital about the way progression works. You may have some freedom over which gates you pass through on your way to the ending, but you still need to beat this boss, grab that item, or learn whatever ability to make it there. The progression gate is either flipped or it isn't. It's either a 1 and will let you through to the game's ending, or it's a 0 and it won't. In Outer Wilds, this paradigm is turned completely on its head. It really is possible to pick up the controller and finish the game in a matter of minutes, without making use of any glitches or speedrun tricks. With only one exception, which is there to keep you in the tutorial until you learn how to play, there are absolutely no progression gates in the game's code to stop you from immediately heading for the ending within minutes of booting the game. So why did it take me about 20 hours to finish the game on my first playthrough? The reason is that Outer Wilds moves its progression system outside of the game and into your brain. The currency of Outer Wilds isn't XP, or souls, or kills, or anything that actually exists inside the game itself. It's knowledge. When you first start playing, you hopefully know absolutely nothing about the game. Your hypothetical knowledge meter is at 0, not dissimilar to the way many action games start you off with just a few abilities. As you continue to play, led by your curiosity to make discoveries and see new things, you begin to learn and add to your knowledge. Let's say you explore the orbital cannon and discover that one of its modules is missing. Judging by the view from the projection console, you can be fairly certain that it's fallen down to the center of Giant's Deep, but since you're not capable of passing below the surface currents, you might reasonably assume that there's some way through you just don't know yet. Elsewhere on Giant's Deep though, we can find a clue to the whereabouts of the missing pilot we would have heard about before leaving our home planet, over in Dark Bramble. So just from exploring one planet, Giant's Deep, we've come away with both a question to keep in the back of our minds and a hint to point us towards another mystery somewhere else. Almost every location in Outer Wilds strikes this balance between giving you clues that will help you solve problems elsewhere and giving you mysteries that need to be solved with clues learned elsewhere. For one more example, take a look at Brittle Hollow, whose observatory reveals the secret of how to pass under the current on Giant's Deep. But the planet also houses the Black Hole Forge, which can only be accessed once you understand how teleporting from Ash Twin works. Whichever planet you visit first, you'll likely leave with some mysteries left unsolved, and with some clues in mind that will help you solve a mystery somewhere else. Each planet in the system is connected in this intricate web of knowledge, meaning that there's no single correct place to start, and also no single correct pathway through it. To reinforce this, some knowledge can actually be gained from multiple sources, making it more likely you'll come across it. For instance, no matter which Know My Escape pod you discover first, it will still clue you into the existence of the others. To reach the game's ending, you need 3 key pieces of information, each of which itself requires a lot of other knowledge to obtain. You need the coordinates of the eye, you need to know how to reach the vessel, and you need to know about the warp core in the center of Ash Twin. To get the coordinates, you need to know about the cyclones on Giant's Deep to get under the water, and then about the jellyfish to get through the electric field. Neither of those facts is learned on Giant's Deep. In order to reach the vessel, you need to have discovered the Know My Escape pod in Dark Bramble, and you need to be able to avoid the anglerfish using a trick which is learned on Ember Twin. In order to access the warp core in the center of Ash Twin, you have to understand how teleporting using the black holes works, which you learn at the White Hole Station and in the Energy Lab on Ember Twin. You can probably see just how complicated this all gets, and to its credit, Outer Wilds had a lot more meat to it than I was expecting after my first few hours with it. Now you might be thinking that the structure I'm describing is actually pretty similar to games in the Metroidvania genre, only instead of progressing when you get new upgrades and abilities, you progress when you get new information. This is a pretty fair comparison, but there's one key difference. In Metroidvania games, when you unlock a new ability, it can usually be used in multiple places to get you through doors or other obstacles that were previously blocking your path, whereas in Outer Wilds, almost everything you learn is only useful in one specific place or scenario. Take the knowledge that jellyfish insulate you from electricity. It's only useful in exactly one instance, although with it being quite a niche situation, this is fair enough. I don't think the same could be said of the quantum rules, however, which the player is taught in various places, but only really asked to use in one puzzle on the quantum moon and nowhere else. It definitely would have been possible to add more quantum puzzles that made use of the quantum rules learnt by the player over the course of the game, but on the whole I'm glad the developers showed restraint in not doing so. If they had included multiple quantum puzzles, it would have been just a little too Metroidvania-esque. Not only would the solutions have lost some of their intrigue by being repeated more often, they also would have gained some special status above the solutions to other puzzles, and I think the game works better as a kind of level playing field, where each key opens just one lock. Okay, so Outer Wilds is all about knowledge, but how does that actually manifest itself in the minute-to-minute gameplay? How do you actually acquire the information that's so essential to the game's progression? Sometimes finding new info is as simple as walking into a room and translating the writing on the floor or wall, although you can still gain insight from paying closer attention, like recognizing that this space in Brittle Hollow is a classroom, or that the rougher looking text was written by No My Children. Usually when the game gives away something as easily as this, however, it's only a small part of a larger problem to solve. The children's writing in The Sunless City, for example, instructs you to throw a light into the fish skeleton's mouth in order to find the way to it from the Stepping Stones cave, and you need to follow through with that to get the final piece of information you came for. This children's writing about the anglerfish cave is another example of knowledge that could be learned from multiple sources, by the way. Some information is hidden behind environmental puzzles or challenges, usually based on observation. This scroll in the Sunless City can only be reached by figuring out that the upper and lower chambers here are connected, and working out which one of these sand holes you need to fall down. Sometimes you need to plan ahead and do multiple things on different planets in order to reach somewhere. To get into the Black Hole Forge on Brittle Hollow, you need to understand how to teleport using Ash Twin, how and where to move the forge into position, and which order to do these things in. One trick in particular is used quite frequently in Outer Wilds. See if you can tell what the following puzzles all have in common. The anti-gravity pathway into the Tower of Quantum Knowledge on Brittle Hollow has collapsed, so in order to get access you need to wait for the tower to fall into the black hole, after which you can freely float inside. On Giant's Deep, you need to wait for the island you're on to be launched into space, so that you can use the brief window of weightlessness to cross over this gap. To reach the Sun Station, you need to be at this spot on Ash Twin at precisely the right time to traverse this room while the sand is still present to cover the spikes. The pattern here is that these puzzles all involve being in the right place at the right time, or just waiting for an event to happen. In the first case, being in the right place at the right time requires you to plan ahead and understand why that time and place are important. In the case of puzzles that just require you to wait for something to happen, it's possible to stumble into the solution by accident, purely by standing near the puzzle for long enough. I actually don't think this detracts from the enjoyment of solving them, however, because it still takes that leap of logic from you to realize that whatever has changed will now give you access to what you need. On that island in Giant's Deep, I can imagine that someone who spends a few minutes trying to figure out how to cross that gap would be surprised and delighted to be thrown into space and suddenly realize that they can now get over there. It's just a shame there isn't actually anything important over there. I think I've said enough now about the way Outer Wilds gives out information and tests the player's understanding of it, but I just want to mention one more knowledge-based mechanic that I think is a great touch. On the planets with No My settlements, Ember Twin and Brittle Hollow, there are shortcuts cleverly hidden in plain sight which drastically cut down the time it takes to get into the middle of these settlements. The really great thing about these shortcuts is that they exist the whole time you're playing the game. You just won't realize they're there until you learn about them by exiting from the other side, making them a perfect example of the knowledge-based progression system I've spent this whole chapter talking about. If you compare Outer Wilds' system to the more traditional progression present in other games, I think it's plain to see why it feels so revolutionary, and it allows for an almost unparalleled amount of freedom, with no two players having exactly the same experience. There's one final bit of design in Outer Wilds that feeds into this knowledge mechanic, and it's one that's absolutely pivotal to its success. Having most of the progression take place in the player's own head is a risky path for a game to tread, as there's no guarantee that every player will think about things in quite the same way. It's for this reason that the ship's log is such an essential addition to the game, as it clearly categorizes and links information together, as well as letting the player know whether or not they've finished exploring an area. Making the log only accessible from the ship was a good decision, because it lets checking the log become a natural part of the ritual of starting a new time loop, while ensuring that the player won't be constantly relying on it when they're exploring on foot. Unfortunately, the knowledge-based progression in Outer Wilds is also the reason that it has a replay value very close to 0. Judging by the length of the footage I recorded when I replayed the game for this video, Outer Wilds has around 8 hours worth of content to see and do everything, but as I've said, on my first playthrough it kept me completely engrossed for closer to 20. This wasn't because of filler content wasting my time and inflating the game's length, as it would have been in any other open world game I could care to mention. It was because I was totally under the game's spell, absorbed in picking apart the game's web of knowledge thread by thread, discovering new information and slowly fitting it together. Just as a puzzle game takes longer to finish the first time, but can be sped through by someone who already knows all the solutions, Outer Wilds can be quickly completed when you replay it and know exactly what to do. It's obvious, however, that rushing straight for the ending is not really getting the most out of the experience. After all, the majority of a first playthrough is spent not actually knowing that there even is an ending. Outer Wilds is a game that really can't be experienced twice, because on subsequent playthroughs you're not building up knowledge from scratch like you were the first time, which is why it has negligible replay value. Of course, I've always thought that wishing you could experience a game for longer is closer to a compliment than a complaint, and I don't think Outer Wilds should be criticised too much for this. Not every experience is supposed to go on forever. This isn't a roguelike. Still, finishing Outer Wilds for the first time will leave you hungry for another experience like it, and there sadly just aren't any other games that quite compare. Or at least, not any modern ones. Even when it comes to the newest, boldest and most innovative ideas, it's often possible to point to something older and say, hey, turns out that idea has been around for longer than we thought. Although this often only becomes obvious in hindsight, when the brilliance of the shiny new thing makes curious people look for evidence of it elsewhere. I'm not so sure if that applies here though, because the example I've come up with for a progenitor of Outer Wilds was the best-selling PC game of all time for most of the 90s, until The Sims finally beat it on sales in 2002. I'm speaking, of course, about Myst. Looking back now, almost 30 years later, it's kind of staggering how many reviewers at the time were gushing about Myst, but easier to understand by putting yourself into their 1993 shoes. You've got to remember that Myst was one of the first ever games to release on a CD-ROM, so its pre-rendered environments were something of a technical marvel at the time. But it's the way that players experienced the game that left a far bigger impression on reviewers than the graphics. To those playing Myst around the time it was released, it was an incredibly immersive experience, proof that games could be art, an artistic masterwork that set a new standard and left players feeling as though they'd visited a real place. Maybe it's not too surprising then that Myst is still being remade, remastered and ported to every console and device you can think of, and even got a brand new VR version just a few months ago. The original even inspired the first ever parody game, Pyst, which I strongly recommend not looking up. I'm serious. Wait, is that John Goodman?
Hello there!
Clearly there was something about Myst's design that helped it leave such a lasting mark on the gaming landscape back in the 90s. The pre-rendered backgrounds and animations, impressive for their time, were surely a contributing factor to the immersive experience reviewers had at the time, but after playing Myst myself for the first time last year, I think there's a little more to it than that. In Myst, there's nothing in the way of health bars, ammo counters, or any other kind of abstraction of information. Everything that the game communicates to you is done in a believable way that consistently sticks to an internal logic at all times. And as you discover the game's story, you have to fit the pieces together in your head to make sense of things. Sound familiar? You need to hold the layout of the game's settings in your head and solve the puzzles of each world using your own powers of observation and logic. Just like Outer Wilds, Myst succeeds in removing the little immersion-breaking conveniences that would come to infest later games, like map markers, menus and super senses, instead trusting in the player's intelligence and curiosity to lead them to new discoveries and solutions. In fact, now that I'm going through similarities, the separate books of Myst could almost be compared to the separate planets of Outer Wilds, though the latter game obviously gives you a lot more freedom in how you travel between them, with Myst having specific and singular entrances and exits to each world. Now, I'm sorry in advance for slamming a game that's almost as old as I am, but I feel compelled to bring up that this bit in the submarine might be one of the most tedious and awful sections I've ever had to suffer through in any game I've ever played. This is absolute torture to do even once, and the fact that you have to do it twice to get to the game's true ending is a fucking crime. Questionable travelling sequences aside though, it's plain to see a lot of things in common between Myst and Outer Wilds. In pointing out these similarities, I'm not trying to claim that Outer Wilds is guilty of stealing ideas, at least no more so than any other creative artwork is. But I thought the comparison was an interesting one, and it demonstrates first of all just how many great ideas are still waiting to be rediscovered in older games, but also just how wrong we went somewhere in between the release of Myst and of Outer Wilds a quarter of a century later, during which time the trend of hand-holding games that play themselves somehow took over, and I can't help but imagine an alternate timeline where that didn't happen. Naturally, comparing the two games also shows how far we've come in the intervening years, as Outer Wilds benefits from several decades of advancement in computing power, which it uses to absolutely steamroll Myst in terms of visuals and interactivity. Whereas Myst restricts the player to predetermined vantage points, a necessity because of its pre-rendered environments, Outer Wilds allows for full 360-degree vision and movement, which gives it an obvious edge in terms of making its world feel like a real space you can move through, and allows the player infinitely more freedom in how they traverse and discover the game's world. There's a conceptual line that can be drawn between the experiences offered by Myst and Outer Wilds, with very few other games appearing on it. If I had to summarise the common thread between these games though, I'd say that they're both about observation and discovery, with a faith in the player's intelligence that most games today don't even come close to respecting. Not coincidentally, testing the player's skills of observation is something that the majority of modern games seem to have forgotten about, often removing the need for observation at all by just having the game do it for you in the name of convenience. And so, despite its ancient lineage as far as the brief existence of computer games is concerned, Outer Wilds remains a game that's hard to squeeze into traditional genre definitions, and there really is nothing else quite like it. Oh, except now there is. Outer Wilds DLC, Echoes of the Eye, which in some ways is more like a sequel, really deserves a video of its own, so stay tuned for that and make sure you play it before I spoil it for you. As for the original game, it's time to tie this video off with a bow. Every now and then, a game comes out that changes everything. Early 3D efforts like Doom and Super Mario 64 have a natural place in this category for pioneering their genres and providing a template for later games to follow. Half-Life, Resident Evil 4, and Dark Souls deserve a spot in that gaming hall of fame for more or less the same reasons, and they created new genres and set new standards as they went. The most recent addition that I think can be comfortably placed on this list is Breath of the Wild, which in the 5 short years since its release seems to have had a profound effect on subsequent games, with the freedom offered by its climbing and stamina systems inspiring seemingly countless others, which makes me very curious to see what they change or keep for the upcoming sequel. Now, you already know that the reason I'm bringing up this hypothetical list is because I believe that Outer Wilds deserves a place on it. Given the long development time of modern games, it's technically a little too soon to say whether it will really have the kind of influence that those other games did. But what I can say is this, and I say it with confidence. If this game clicks with you, then by the time you reach the end, it will have you on your knees praying that this is the birth of a new genre, because you will be desperate to play it, or anything like it, again for the first time. For the sake of fairness, I think I ought to repeat that just like Dark Souls before it, Outer Wilds is a game that may not click with everyone. It asks for a certain amount of investment and attention from the player, and while it repays that investment in spades, some players may falter at the beginning and struggle to get over the hurdle necessary to get you hooked. Some players just prefer more linear and structured experiences, and are simply not interested in playing a game that puts more of a responsibility on them to work out what to do. Which is fine, because not every game needs to be for every player. And as studios working under ruthless companies like EA have proven time and time again, a game designed for some people to love is always more worthwhile than a game designed for mass appeal. But regardless of whether Outer Wilds itself satisfies every player that tries it, I think it can't be denied that the game offers some elegant solutions to problems that have been plaguing bigger budget games for a long time. In terms of immersion, freedom, and respect for the player's intelligence, Outer Wilds wipes the floor with any other game that's come out in recent memory, and I'm fully expecting that the next 10 years will prove its importance, as the ideas and lessons learned from its development make their way into the games of the future. It provides an experience that can't be found anywhere else, and for that reason it's surely only a matter of time before other developers catch on, if they haven't already. If you've made it to the end of this video, then I hope it's because you've already played Outer Wilds for yourself. I hope that your time with the game meant as much to you as it did to me, and that I've been able to do it justice here and capture what makes it such a beautiful, important, terrifying, or inspiring experience. And more than anything else, I hope that there are many like it yet to come. Thanks for watching.